So this video is based off of the media tour information for the Sage. Take potency values like Toxicon at 330 damage potency or Holos at 300 healing potency with a grain of salt, because values may be very different when Endwalker is officially released next month. This is definitely going to be a long video, and as such I have provided an excessive amount of timestamps. I did ask the community, and so the gloves are really off on this video, and I'm not holding back any of the details. So totally make use of timestamps, leave, come back whenever you want to the video. It isn't really a one sitting kind of video. Alternatively, the text form of this is on my own website evix.gg under the Sage Ultimate Guide. Links will be in the description as well as the pinned comment. So we're going to be going into depth about the Sage here. This isn't just going to be a skill review, we are getting down and dirty, absolutely filthy. So in this video I'm going to be covering the following topics. First off is going to be mechanics in-depth analysis. We're going to be looking at Kardia, Addersgall, Addersting, and ability augmentation system called EUCRASIA for the Sage. The second section is going to be on abilities, where we're going to be going into the depth and not just a primer of the abilities, but actually going into the use cases of them, where we're going to be talking about DPS abilities first, healing abilities, modification abilities. Note, this is not EUCRASIA and the augmentation system abilities. The fourth section in abilities is going to be mobility actions, and then we're going to close it off by going into the role actions. The third section of this video is going to be on openers and rotations, where we're going to be talking about the single target opener and rotation and really what you're going to do during a maintenance phase. And then we're going to be going into AoE, which is going to be more of a priority based kind of like approach rather than a specific opener or rotation. You guys know as well as I do, if you're running a dungeon, things aren't quite as nice as you might want them to be. That's going to get us into the fourth section, which is going to be a general healing approach, which is going to be very important for the Sage, for all healer jobs actually, but especially so with the Sage. One thing to note is, as I'm sure that a lot of you are going to pick up as I go through this list here, you're going to notice this is going to go from highest priority to absolute lowest priority in what you want to do. So we're going to start off with background healing, your Kardia system, and then we're going to go into raw damage mitigation. You don't need to heal damage that doesn't exist. Then we're going to go into off-global cooldown healing and barriers. Interestingly enough, barriers, you'll learn that in the Sage Guide, HAIMA and PANHAIMA. Then we're going to go into barriers, and we're talking about on-global cooldown barriers here. Then we're going to be talking about on-global cooldown healing, and then we're going to close that up with a wrap-up. It's going to lead us into our fifth section, which is going to be takeaways and thoughts, where I am also very concerned for the Sage, but on the flip side, I am also extremely happy. Definitely a buyer beware kind of job. Let's crack off into section number one, which is going to be the Sage's mechanics. And the Sage is going to be broken down into 4 core mechanics. Technically, I'd normally say 3, but we are throwing in ability augmentation for good measure here. So first up is going to be the Kardia system, and Kardia is a brand new mechanic to Final Fantasy XIV with the addition of the new healer job Sage. Welcome to its ultimate guide, and it is honestly something that has me and many others extremely excited for the Sage. It is quite literally turning your damage into healing, which is absolutely badass to say the least. Brand new mechanics for healers that involves my and many others' favorite pastime is smashing faces as a healer. But buyer beware, before you jump onto the hype train about this skill in the Sage, this Kardia mechanic might make the Sage the absolute worst healer for you to pick if you are not comfortable doing a lot of damage. So the Kardia system allows the Sage to designate one party member as the Kardia target. This party member will get a 170 potency heal every time you do a damaging attack. Yes, any attack in the Sage's entire kit that does damage triggers this 170 potency heal effect on the Kardia target. Just to dispel and make sure that I address any misinformation that I have been seeing going around the community, Kardia does not scale off of the damage that you're doing. It is a flat 170 potency heal per damaging ability that you do. This healing can be boosted using SOTERIA off the global cooldown that can boost us from 170 potency per attack to 340 potency per attack. And while this might seem off the wall insane, and it is absolutely going to be powerful, the Kardia system isn't suddenly going to make every other healer invalid. In fact, Kardia is just simply the Sage's version of the Scholar's Fairy or White Mage and Astrologian's regen effect. Kardia, however, is extremely unique in spite of this. Is going to be a persistent effect that you don't need to refresh in combat, which makes it similar to the Scholar's Fairy, and unlike the White Mage and Astro regen, which does require a global cooldown cast and constant refreshes, which, as you could imagine, would force you to stop casting damaging spells to reapply that regen on the GCD, and that is going to be a lot more significant than you might first suspect when you hear about it. So pulling up top speed kill rankings involving the White Mages indicated that regen was cast on average 1 time during that entire fight, and an average HP per second contribution was an abysmally low 132 HPS. Like, compare that to some of the other values that you're seeing on screen right now. 132 is not good. Now contrast this to the Scholar with the Fairy Pet that is going to be consistently throwing out Embrace passively, not costing GCD casts at all, and that's going to average at 72 Embrace casts over the fight, which averages at 1.2 HP per second. But the maximum HP per second was a mind-blowing 2k HPS just from Fairy Embrace. So really, to say the least, raiders are wanting to try and avoid casting regen as much as possible. And I think that we've really covered enough about passive versus active application, and let's talk control, because this is a huge factor in this. And control of where the Scholar's Fairy casts Embrace is something that has been a significant pain point in Shadowbringers, where we don't have a thing like a Fairy macro to Embrace cast. Used to be able to use macros on the Scholar to really target where the Fairy wants to cast. This, however, isn't a problem for white mages or astrologians, because they can apply their regen to a particular target and that regen will just keep ticking on them. Now, that isn't everything being great in Paradise. The problem with that, though, is that it can lead to a metric ton of overhealing if it's not timed out properly, and be essentially a wasted cast that you might have wanted to be a little bit more flexible and change targets on its own, like what the Scholar's Fairy is doing on its own. And as you probably guessed it, Kardia is truly the best of both worlds. Kardia is going to give you that deep level of control to decide exactly where its healing is going, rather than potentially healing minor chip damage on a DPS that you're not worried about, or aimlessly funneling overhealing into a full health tank. Since all attacks are 1.5 seconds cast time, and Kardia is an off GCD ability with a super short cooldown of 5 seconds or 2 GCDs, and a depth sage will be able to easily weave Kardia targets while getting damage off. I'm going to coin the term Kardia weaving for this. So what we're really seeing here is going to be a persistent effect with a ton of control. To say the absolute least, I am a huge fan of the Kardia system. This is giving me everything that I ever wanted and more. And this is kind of really where the Kardia system is truly bonkers. Again, that granular level of control while also being a persistent background effect. That's exceedingly powerful, and when used properly will no doubt produce bonkers HPS values and differentiate a Sage that it just is like casually Sage versus someone who's really an expert at Sage. But now we need to start talking about the dark side of the moon in Endwalker. That really starts to get into the conversation that this skill's very apparent simplicity when you read it at first is very deceptive. While it can be very effective just applied to the main tank, the trick is in the details, where manipulating where Kardia is placed actively will distinguish the best of the best Sages from the rest. So this quickly gets into the next wall of the Kardia system, which does assume that you are going to be using your DPS skills a lot. And I mean a lot, which may pose itself as a challenge to players who aren't as comfortable and make the Kardia system a complete waste. And when I say it, I do mean it like from a very genuine, sincere spot. If you're one of the healers that chooses to play a healer because you want to heal and you don't want a DPS, I would run away from the Sage. Very quickly away from it. I would use the Scholar Shuffle to run away from the Sage. So let's pull up the top ranking numbers for the Scholars and the White Mages, and we can see that the White Mages are casting a total of 147.7 on global cooldown damage spells, and the Scholars are going to be casting an average of 163.5 on global cooldown damage spells. Now imagine those casts multiplied by 170 potency Kardia, if they were Sage skills of course. But to future-proof this video, I will say that Scholar and White Mages needed to explicitly weave in off GCD abilities prior to Endwalker, so they will need to stop casting Glare or stop casting Broil to weave, and in the future we will see that all healers have their basic spammable ability on a 1.5 second cast time, which allows a steady constant weave like Astrologian does today in Shadowbringers. It is incredibly likely that we will see an uptick of on GCD damage spell usage from this change, so definitely be aware of that. So that really gets us into the takeaway for the Kardia system. This is definitely a buyer beware system. If you pick up the Sage, be ready to DPS heavily, or be open to the idea of learning to. It might be intimidating at first, but as I have always said on this channel, practice is really important, and not letting yourself get demoralized. Honestly, just do your best. Heaven knows that I am going to cause some brutal wipes with this on Endwalker launch. I'm not too proud to admit to that. There will be many deaths because of my BS, I mean learning. And heck, you're on a guide video right now. I'm not trying to lord myself over anyone when I say this. This is going to be a learning experience for all of us. After all, it's a brand new job. I mean, just as I've always said, like, just try and practice. I'm just trying to make sure that you're aware, like, this is what you're getting into with the Sage. So the next mechanics for the Sage are going to be Addersgall and Addersting, which I really want to take a moment here and explain the Serpent and Medicine lore, because I think that it might help a lot of people wrap their hand around the overarching mechanic. I did do a deep dive explaining every aspect of the Sage's kit and its relation to Greek mythology. Like, we're seeing Greek goddesses SOTERIA here, we're seeing Icarus, and I'm just going to do a very diet version here. So Adders is going to be a word related directly to snakes, and in medicine there is a commonly used symbol involving snakes called the caudaceous staff, and so the snake was really commonly tied to medicine, where the sage lore and inspiration is really being drawn from. But for snakes, there is this division between poison, the bite, the so-called sting, and then the gall, the short for the gallbladder, that is going to be an organ that secretes bile, which in various circles is considered a therapeutic healing ingredient. When we're talking about bile, we're really going to be talking about the four humors in the Greek medicine lore. And so the sage, as a healer that revolves around dealing a crap ton of DPS, as we just really fleshed out in the Kardia section, is still a healer. It's got both elements of serpent, the healing gallbladder, and then the vicious sting to harm its foes. But people might be confused with that. Gallbladders? Oh my god, what does that have to do with this? And this is actually going to go into a lot of deep Greek lore talking about the four humors, where it was considered essential to have the right combination of these four humors. And by humor, it isn't meaning a joke, like it's referring to the fluids in the body. I should disclaim it before someone memes. But for the sake of the core mechanics of the sage, we have Addersgall, which is all about healing by expending Addersgall charges on skills ending with the suffix "chole." So bile skills, think about cholesterol. Related to the gall, the gallbladder, the yellow bile, healing. And then we have on the other end, expending Addersting to cause harm through toxins, meaning damaging abilities. So now with that out of the way, let's dive into the actual mechanics of Addersgall in 14, and this is going to be a special resource that you can expend for powerful healing tools. If you're familiar with the Scholar's Aetherflow gauge, it's like 90% the exact same idea, if I'm honest. There are going to be 3 gemstones at the top of the sage's gauge that recover at a rate of 1 Addersgall, which is the gemstone, per 20 seconds, and that 20 seconds is going to be indicated in the middle blue bar that simply shows you the time left to get another Addersgall. One thing that is very important to note about Addersgall is that they do recover outside of combat, allowing you to have them as options immediately, so don't feel helpless on getting charges beforehand. You're going to be spending one of these charges of Addersgall to use one of 4 special abilities that cost Addersgall. These abilities all end with the suffix "chole", think like cholesterol, which is going to be referring to the bile or the gall. Addersgall for gallbladder. First up is DRUOCHOLE, which is going to be a handy emergency heal that can be weaved off of the global cooldown to heal a single target for 600 potency. For absolutely all intents and purposes, this is exactly Scholar's Lustrate ability, which is very well known as being a handy emergency tool. KERACHOLE is going to be an extremely powerful ability where we're applying 2 buffs simultaneously to allies. The first one is going to be a 10% damage mitigation, which in and of itself is extremely powerful. But on the other side, we are going to be getting a light heal over time trickle that will add up to 500 total potency of healing. And even better, this is an AoE. So again, this is exactly like the Scholar's ability called Sacred Soil. Tank pulled big, use KERACHOLE. Raid-wide damage coming in, KERACHOLE. I cannot emphasize this enough. Do not underestimate this ability. This actually is quite bonkers. And if I'm being really frank, this is going to be one of those abilities that you can pretty much justify using off of cooldown in some form in harder forms of content. It is really good. IXOCHOLE is going to be our next ability, which is going to be a quote-unquote simple burst of 400 HP to the party. To say the least, it is going to be a handy tool for recovering party health in a big burst. I say simple in quotation marks because this is actually one of the strongest abilities. Why I say this is because if anyone is noticing a pattern yet, then yes, this is the direct equivalent to the Scholar's Indom heal, which to say the least has proven itself to be extremely useful, to say the absolute least, in raid-wide healing. Like if you pull up current FF logs for top ranking Scholars, you can see that this ability, the Indom ability, is very, very, very high up there. Sages getting this, so I'd expect pretty much the same results. Now we've arrived at TAUROCHOLE, and this is going to be extremely similar to DRUOCHOLE, but it has an additional 10% damage mitigation tied to it that lasts 15 seconds and on a 45-second cooldown timer. This cooldown timer is likely smacked on it to prevent the spamming of it. This is actually one ability that seems very unique to stand on for the Sage, unlike the Scholar, and it's really gonna be beautiful. On-demand damage mitigation is beautiful. It's like Yoshi P has literally heard my dreams and made this ability, and I'm like, I love TAUROCHOLE. So now let's go down and like express some of the insanity here and delve into some of the fun stuff that you can do as a Sage. One thing that I should mention before I get into it is that you cannot stack TAUROCHOLE and its 10% mitigation with the 10% mitigation from IXOCHOLE, which one or the other, you really need to make a choice between either IXOCHOLE or you need to do TAUROCHOLE. all. But it results in this fascinating interaction between the two that you can be using a lot, and I know I will be as a sage. Guaranteed this is going to be very important. So IXOCHOLE lasts 15 seconds, 10% mitigation, 30-second cooldown. TAUROCHOLE lasts 15 seconds, 10% mitigation, 45-second cooldown. Now, I know, guys, that I'm getting ahead of myself here, but we're going to also be bringing up PNHAIMA, which is going to be a very powerful ability we will talk about shortly, but this is going to also apply another 10% mitigation. There are no limitations set on the tooltip, so this is likely going to stack with the two, but we are going to be talking about spreading it here, and that's going to be 10% mitigation on a 20-second duration. Much longer 120-second cooldown though, so buyer beware. So taking all of these abilities, and in the warped world that I have lived in far too many times where tanks don't use cooldowns at all, ever, this lets me use IXOCHOLE, chain TAUROCHOLE, and we can use IXOCHOLE again for 45 seconds of 10% mitigation. We can use PNHAIMA here to extend it, and after that the cycle can start a little bit more. We will eventually run out of it because PNHAIMA is going to be a 120-second cooldown, so we can't cycle it in perpetuity, but we can cycle it for a disgusting amount of time. And at this point, I don't know what else to say other than the sage is making me so happy. You guys have no idea how happy this combo makes me. So that does it for all the Addersgall gauge and abilities. Now it's time to talk about the Addersting, and this is going to be similar to the Addersgall in that it can cap out at 3 charges. Charges, however, are not acquired outside of combat and do require a shielded target, specifically shielded with Eukrasian Diagnosis, the single target shield, not Eukrasian Prognosis, which is the AoE shield. I know that I'm emphasizing that, but seriously guys, make note, it's not Eukrasian Prognosis, it's not the AoE shield, it's just the single target shield. But this target with your Eukrasian Diagnosis single target shield needs to take damage to the point that it breaks the shield. Think about it exactly like something in the current game, which is the Dark Knight needs their Blackest Night shield smashed to get a special proc. That smashing of your Eukrasian Diagnosis shield will give you a charge of Addersting. Think about it like, "Ree, you hurt my friend, now you will die, ree!" So now let's talk about the spenders. And Toxicon is going to be your only spender for this gauge, and Toxicon is going to be a 330 potency burst of damage that deals 165 potency of damage to surrounding targets, which really makes it so that Toxicon neither outdamages DOSIS in single target or EUCRASIA in area of effect engagements. More on those in a second, meaning that the real particular advantage of Toxicon is explicitly in that it is instant cast, which means that you get 2 big benefits. You can do it while using very large movements to not interrupt anything, or mechanics, like say you have a mechanic where you need to go right side of the arena to left side of arena, then you can just blow 3 charges moving over. Or alternatively, this enables double weaving, where the 1.5 second cast time of DOSIS is more restrictive for off GCD weaving and mobility, where you get a little bit of mobility, and you can combine that obviously with slide casting, which I will always encourage, but it's still much more limited, as well as you can only weave in 1 off global cooldown ability. However, guys, do not underestimate the power of that 1.5 second cast time weave for mobility. Even in current day astrology, you can do a significant mechanic avoiding movement with that and combine that 1 second window with slide casting. It is very, very powerful. This is actually why I'm recommending in other videos, check out Ast if you're interested in the Sage, get used to that. So really, in closing for Toxicon, beyond any shadow of a doubt, this is going to be a tremendously helpful ability to keep the Sage casting on the fly. As the Sage does not really have any ability that would allow them to run around and proc Kardia aside from it, this is actually going to be incredibly important. Just making sure that you're always getting out damage, always getting that Kardia proc. This is doing a little bit to facilitate that. Now the final mechanic that we're talking about for the Sage is going to be EUCRASIA, and this is going to be the Sage's augmentation system button. Recall from earlier in the video when we talked about the lore that EUCRASIA is a healthy balance of the 4 humors in Greek lore. You can bet that a big portion of playing the Sage right is going to be making sure that you have a healthy balance of using this ability. Is that corny? Someone's going to say in the comments and flame me for that, guaranteed. Now I need to say here that EUCRASIA and the augmentation system, I have seen so much speculation online and talking about it. However, it is a lot more simple than people have really speculated on. So EUCRASIA is going to be a 1 second cast time on the GCD ability that augments 3 different abilities. I will note, interestingly enough though, is that these augmented abilities have reduced recast timer to 1.5 seconds, so that's the recast timer, and are going to be instant cast. The instant cast is a huge perk on its own, as is the reduced timer, to make sure that this combination of EUCRASIA to get EUCRASIA Diagnosis, EUCRASIA DOSIS, EUCRASIA Prognosis out is not going to go over your default 2.5 second GCD. Not to mention, the little bit of a reduced cast time is going to make it easier to do movements, like bigger movements than you could maybe normally do. But moving on from that, the 3 abilities that are going to be changed are, first of all, Diagnosis, which is turning the standard single target heal diagnosis to Eukrasian diagnosis, which is a heal plus barrier. The second one is going to be Prognosis, which is turning the Prognosis basic AoE heal into a Eukrasian Prognosis, which is going to be an AoE heal plus barrier. Buyer beware, Eukrasian Prognosis's healing aspect is significantly weak at 100 default cure potency. If you're used to Scholar, do not expect the same amount of actual raw healing behind it. Sakura is currently at 180, Prognosis is currently at 100, but the shield aspects are the exact same. Sorry, I know a little bit of tangent, but I know a lot of Scholar players like myself look at the skill and are like, wait, what the hell? So what we're seeing with this skill is it has a higher percentage of the health turned into a barrier. And now thirdly, we have Dosis, which is turning the basic single target spammable attack into Eukrasian Dosis, which has a single target damage over time effect. Specifically, we are looking at 30 seconds of the dot divided by 3, because that's how much dots tick, is going to equal 10 ticks, and 10 ticks rated at 70 potency is going to add up to 700 potency for each cast of Eukrasia Dosis, which immediately to everyone's mind should be like, this is a top priority to get raid buffed. This is actually our single strongest on GCD cast that we can have. And for the record, dots in Final Fantasy XIV do snapshot buffs, or let's put it in easy and honest terms. Eukrasia can be said like, I put a shield on my basic heals and I make my basic single target spam a damage over time effect. Truth be told, I kind of view it as a one way to reduce button bloat by a hotkey to change these 3 keys, but in reality it's just 2 buttons that you're saving? I don't know. For other healers, it means that they are actually going to put the equivalent of Cure 1 on their hotbars rather than take it off. I see what you did there. Welcome to section 3, and okay, it is now time to finally get into the abilities breakdown, and I'm going to be covering them in a bit more of their potential use case and details here than I would do like in an overview video as I go through them. So we're going to be talking about like where you're going to use them, why you're going to use them, and some cool interactions. So first off, we're starting off with the DPS abilities. So Dosis is going to be your single target spam ability that deals 330 potency of damage on a 1.5 second cast time. 1.5 seconds cast time with a 2.5 baseline second GCD means that you're gonna have 1 second to weave in anything between that on global cooldown cast of Dosis and your next on global cooldown cast. Spicy. This is going to be incredibly essential to get down right, because you can use that short bit of time to move. You could also even slide cast if you really want to add even more movement. Also, the big perk is that you can weave in any of the powerful off global cooldown abilities in this window as well. In particular, you can fit in 1 off global cooldown ability in this window. 2 will likely cause clipping. A lot of clipping. So really what this does is that this opens up a lot of flexibility for the Sage, and since you have the Kardia mechanic that will heal an ally for using a damaging ability, this is very, and I mean very important, because like I warned in the Kardia section, if you're not going to be doing damaging spells, which are all going to be on the GCD, it's going to be worthless, and you should consider other healer options with enhanced flexibility on this aspect of the kit, like literally any of the other 3 healers. Scholar would be a very great option if you like the Sage's kit but you don't like doing damage, because Eos is going to keep healing. One thing that I will note is something that I did mention earlier in this video, is that this is going to be the exact same timing as the Astrologian in the current game right now with the Malefic spam. And if you really want to get practice with the Sage before the Sage is released, get on the Ast, practice this, get used to slide casting, get used to moving in general with this, get used to doing your weave. Like, I would recommend this to any healer, but especially for Sage players, get used to constantly DPSing. Lastly, to wrap up the talk about Dosis, is that this will be your #1 cast spell more than literally any other spell in the kit. Even looking at current Savage fight data, you can see the Scholar and White Mage have the incredible overwhelming majority of their casts in Glare and Broil, which are going to be equivalent abilities to Dosis. They're probably even going to get more in Endwalker, because they're also getting a 1.5 second, you know what I mean. Point is, get extremely comfortable with this idea if you want to play Sage. So next up is going to be Eukrasian Dosis, and every single healer in this game gets a 30-second damage over time effect, and this is the one for the Sage. As we just talked about in the augmentation section, there is really nothing special about this versus any other damage over time effect in the game for healers. You hit Eukrasia, you hit Dosis, bam, Eukrasian diagnosis is applied. One thing to note, however, is that you should maintain 100% uptime on the stop. We're going to be talking a lot about how important this is for timers in the openers rotation section. If we're just talking purely about damage, pulling up White Mage and Scholar top ranking Raider information again, damage over time effects makes up a very significant chunk of their damage, so do not ignore this. 30 divided by 3, because there is going to be a dot tick every 3 seconds, is going to equal 10 ticks. 10 multiplied by 70 is going to result in 700 potency of damage just from this one single ability. It's very important. And just to cap off this ability to be uber clear, the 170 potency heal from Kardia is coming from any damage spell cast, including the initial cast of Eukrasia DOSIS. Kardia does not tick off of the damage over time portion of Eukrasia DOSIS, only the initial cast. It'd probably be pretty bonkers otherwise, that would get a nerf. Yeah, it's just the initial cast. So Dyscrasia is going to be a very interesting ability for the Sage because it's going to be their basic AoE spammable ability. It's instant cast, it heals 5 meters around yourself, it's direct 170 potency of damage, it is literally Scholar's Art of War. This is going to allow you to move on the fly, double weave. There's no denying this is going to be very, very effective. But here's where the Sage starts to go off the deep end compared to the other healers with more involved DPS abilities. So Phlegma is going to be an on GCD, note on GCD because it's a spell damaging ability that does 510 potency single target and 50% less in AoE. Regardless, that is a metric ton of damage as a healer. Also, very important to note, and we're gonna really be fleshing this out in the opener and rotation section, is that Phlegma gets 2 charges and that charges come back on 45-second intervals. So like with any charge ability, I am thinking like Gauss Round and Ricochet with the Machinist, you are losing value when you don't have a charge ticking back up. Undeniably, one of the first things that you're gonna be doing in a combat opener is a cast of Phlegma. Do note, however, that it has a very small range of 6 meters. So you need to get pretty intimate with your enemy. But as a healer, this shouldn't be too much of a problem because you should be in the middle of the group where the boss is in the center anyhow to hit people with AoE heals. Not to mention, as a Sage, that is going to be the only healing job with literal mobility gap closer, which is the insanely badass Icarus ability, which I love more than I can express. Next ability is Toxicon, that we already spoke about in excess during the Addersting mechanic. You get what's up with it. You have your Eukrasia Diagnosis single target shield break. You get a single charge of your Addersting. Then whenever you need the mobility or to double weave, you just pop Toxicon. It's really that simple. Now this brings us to Pneuma, which is to say the least, bizarrely powerful ability that deals 330 potency damage to all enemies, heals all allies for 400 potency, which, as you remember from the Serpent's Gall section, is going to be the same as the IXOCHOLE ability. It's going to be our burst AoE heal. But on top of that, it deals a powerful 10% mitigation for 20 seconds, which is all combining together to make Pneuma bizarrely, and I mean bizarrely powerful. Oh yeah, and because it does damage, it procs Kardia too, because of course it does, right? But here's where the real trick about Pneuma comes into play, is that it's not necessarily dealing more damage than DOSIS. So do I see this being used in the opener? Absolutely ROFL, rolling on the floor laughing. Hell no, it's too powerful for that. If we're talking dungeons though, on the flip side, it's absolutely going to be great during a big pack pull, but absolutely do not use this during an opener unless you really have a use case that justifies this. It's simply way too powerful to waste like that. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm talking about a modification ability here called Zoe, which is going to allow you to cast Zoe off of the GCD, which, as you know, you can weave in one at any time. Then you cast this, that's going to be 800 potency of healing, because Zoe doubles whatever healing spell you cast's healing potency, so don't use it during an opener, too strong. But from a raid perspective, how I see Pneuma really played out in the developers' minds was they were wanting to tell us from this tooltip, cast this instead of DOSIS when things get rough. Don't worry, we will still give you the damage of DOSIS and the Kardia proc, so chill out dude and use this whenever you need a helping hand. Really, it has the same cast time and recast as DOSIS, exact same damage, it has big healing mitigation perks. I really think it's stupidly strong. I don't know what else to say. This is a very, very worthy capstone ability for any job. For an ability named the Greek word for breath, I think that it is extremely fitting. This is the kind of thing that you're going to be popping out for E12S Terminal Relativity or E11S Electric Cycles, guaranteed. So that does it for the DPS skills of the Sage, and now it is time to move into the healing skills. So let's start off this section with the most basic heal, the Cure 1 equivalent, the Physic equivalent. This is going to be Diagnosis, and no, that extra 50 potency does not make me want to cast it anymore. Based off of current gameplay of healers, Cure 1, Physic, Benefic 1 are almost never cast. These are, for all intents and purposes, dead buttons that some healers even tell to take off your hotbars. Sage still should not be casting this unless they truly have no other option. But now on the flip side, what will make you hit this button is from using Eukrasia first, and then this will turn into a shield plus heal, Eukrasia Diagnosis, and for all intents and purposes, this is really the only time that you should really want to use this button. Since we're already here, I am going to be bringing up some synergy here in that this will be very, very powerful with Zoe as well as KRASIS. I'm gonna leave that discussion more to those abilities. Next up is gonna be Prognosis, and this is gonna be the basic 300 potency spammable Medica 1 or Helios equivalent that makes the Scholar and me cry because we don't have anything like it. IXOCHOLE sucks. This ability, unlike Diagnosis, is actually very important. If you fall behind on raid-wide healing, you at least have an option here. This can be enhanced with EUCRASIA to provide a barrier with the heal to the party like a Sakura equivalent from the Scholar. Now we're starting to crack open into off-global cooldown abilities that are very important to learn and know very well on the Sage. So we're starting off with PHYSIS, which is going to be an off-global cooldown ability, meaning that you can weave it in between casts of DOSIS or other spells without interfering with the on-global cooldown, and this is going to be an incredibly powerful effect that is a direct analog to Whispering Dawn that we see today in Scholar's Kit make up an absolutely huge 2k healing per second on its own. For the record, this is at the top end of gameplay. This is crazy. So don't sleep on PHYSIS just because its effect reads off as weak. It's very strong. So what PHYSIS is literally doing is it applies a 21-second duration heal over time effect to allies that ticks at 21 divided by 3 is 7 ticks. At 7 multiplied by 100 equals 700 total healing potency. And recall that that's on the AoE. The real strength of any ability like this, and we're going to be talking about this a whole lot in the healing approach section, is that anything off the global cooldown is that it's just versatile, and that it can offset the amount of global cooldown casts on global cooldown casts that you need to be spending on something like spamming Prognosis or spamming Diagnosis, things that you want to avoid heavily as the Sage. Really, you look at this as like, it's like opening up your lungs, giving you like the time to like breathe and let your heal over time like tick and take over, and let your GCD really get that constant spam of doses. Like, I cannot stress it enough, especially in a guide video like this, what is going to make you as a Sage perform very well is making sure that you are constantly using that GCD window on DPS abilities, letting these tick. That's how you're going to get more Kardia procs, really how you're going to succeed as a Sage. Next up is going to be SOTERIA, and it is a good thing that I talked about Kardia in detail, huh? So SOTERIA is going to boost the Kardia healing from 170 potency per damaging ability used to 340, literally doubling it for 10 seconds on a reasonable 90-second cooldown timer. Since this too is an ability, it is going to be weavable off the GCD, and you can therefore trigger it between doses casts in preparation to heal off significant chunks of damage. 10 seconds divided by 2.5 second GCD casts is going to be 4 casts of Dosis. 4 casts of Dosis at 340 potency healing is going to be 1,360 healing to a single target. But like we described in the Kardia section, if you really want to be sassy, you could actually change and Kardia weave targets to split this healing among targets. 340 potency is also just barely under the Diagnosis skill at 450 potency, so I'm making how to say it. This is probably making a lot of light bulbs go off and like alarm bells ring in everyone's head saying, oh my god, this is exactly why like we should try and avoid that. Absolutely, because now you're losing the 330 potency of damaging from Dosis, you're going to be it's very rarely worth it. So like, even though SOTERIA is the Greek deity of salvation, safety, deliverance, and preservation of harm, all I can think is yes, I get to blow up the enemy more. I love SOTERIA. So now we're talking about PEPSI. The lore of which is a fantastic drink that I enjoy, that it has a constant rivalry between Coca-Cola. Wait, you're trying to tell me that it's not the same as Pepsi? I don't care, I'm continuing. It's PEPSI in my mind. So this is an off GCD skill that will transform the currently existing shields on allies into a significant burst of healing on a short 15-second cooldown. How you can approach this is you apply a shield, and I should be super specific here. It is not HAIMA, it is not PANHAIMA, it is specifically Eukrasian Diagnosis or Eukrasian Prognosis here. So you apply this on GCD, Eukrasian Diagnosis or Eukrasian Prognosis shield to allies, and then you can simply burst up their HP, trading in that shield for HP burst. Basic, right? And I'm sure that that use case is valid, and I'm always going to say that is powerful when the situation arises. But this is really underestimating the power and the real mechanical depth of the PEPSI skill. PEPSI can be significantly more technical, just like with how Kardia seems simple. You smack it on the tank and then you just be done with the Kardia system, but as we explored before, it has a lot more wiggle room for technical mastery in use cases like Kardia weaving. And now, exact same deal with PEPSI. Note carefully on the PEPSI tooltip, this skill doesn't say that it heals for the exact same amount of shield left on the target, and now bells are ringing. I know they are already ringing in your mind, and you're spot on. The best use case of PEPSI is to apply a shield to an ally, let that ally get whacked, let him get a little roughed up with that shield still on. Now at the very last moment, just before that shield goes away, you pop PEPSIS. Now you've optimized your value. Now you're using the mechanic right. Now you've gotten value out of that shield twice rather than just once. You let that shield itself act as a shield, and then get whacked, and then you turn that barely existing little, whatever you want to call it, little crumb of a shield into a powerful heal, meaning that this is going to be a skill to look out to master. Next up is going to be PHYSIS 2, which is another off GCD heal over time effect, but this time on a significantly shorter duration and higher potency. It's going to be 200 potency over 15 seconds, so 5 ticks total at a total of 1000 potency of healing. So this means that we are in the exact same boat as PHYSIS 1. This PHYSIS 2 ability is just another way to make the most value out of your GCDs and has so much potential that it's pretty amazing. Recall, this has that 10% healing amplification on it. This is going to be absolutely wild when you combine it with some other stuff. Very powerful effect. Really just another tool in your tool to offload the healing away from GCD heals like Prognosis or Diagnosis. It's just going to be powerful. Nothing really else to say on it. This gets us into HOLISM, which is going to be the direct equivalent to Scholar's Fade Blessing at 300 potency burst heal that is cast off of the GCD. I know that I've said it a few times now, but I can't stress it enough. 300 potency is the same potency as Prognosis, and this should always be preferred. Objectively, you're getting the same heal as Prognosis and then 330 damage to the target on top of it. But let's not forget, you're also getting that 170 potency proc from Kardia too because you cast DOSIS instead. Big perks. Always be using something like this when you can. Now we're going to be talking about ham and pineapple. I mean HAIMA, which HAIMA is going to be an extremely unique ability in Final Fantasy XIV. Before I get into the details, I want to just kind of introduce it a bit. You could think about HAIMA and PANHAIMA and pineapple as being like the barrier version of a regen. So getting into the details of HAIMA is that HAIMA will apply to a single target an initial barrier that is equivalent to a 150 potency heal. Not impressive alone, I agree. But the additional effect is that it will apply 5 stacks of HAIMA to a target that lasts 30 seconds. When one of the barriers is completely destroyed, like that first upfront 150 potency barrier is being smashed by auto attack damage for instance, then 1 stack of HAIMA is going to be depleted and then a brand new 150 potency barrier is going to be applied to that same target to replace the one that was just broken. And then when that replacement shield is broken, that consumes yet another stack of HAIMA to produce a brand new 150 potency barrier. I know that you're already getting the picture, so I'm going to move on. Rinse and repeat, you're just getting 150 potency barrier there, after barrier, which like any other barrier is kept on top of the target's health, and once that is depleted, puts up a brand new one for 150 potency. So we really get 6 multiplied by 150 potency worth of barriers. And so 6 multiplied by 150 is going to be 900 potency of barriers, which to say the absolute least is an incredibly significant effect, especially when you consider that this is a very simple off-global cooldown weave. This will be extremely useful regardless if it is in a raid or a dungeon because it really softens successive incoming damage. Like imagine a big wall-to-wall. It'll be brilliant. During a raid boss doing auto attacks, brilliant. Even if the raid boss is doing a tank buster that will often follow up with auto attacks that can and has killed tanks in raids, this is going to dampen it out of the gate and then the successive auto attacks. Very good. What is worth noting is that this does stack with Eukrasian Diagnosis, so you can get an upfront big beefy barrier ahead of that tank buster. And frankly, this effect, while I can explain how powerful it is, it might not really resonate with people, but try and view it from the framework that we use Kardia that is healing underneath barriers with healing, like healing the HP. The barrier is going to be concurrently on top of that, which allows the sage to manage a steady stream of consistent damage through different angles, the barrier with HAIMA or PANHAIMA, and then the Kardia effect healing underneath. Really, we're producing a non-stop protective barrier stream as the sage themselves restores it underneath in parallel. Too long didn't read version is this will let the sage DPS more. Now I want to talk about the last effect, which I didn't mention yet because truthfully I don't see it happening all that often with standard normal HAIMA usage, but once the 30-second duration timer expires on those stacks of HAIMA, then the HAIMA stacks are all going to be consumed and turned into a 150 potency of healing per stack. In practical use, that should almost never be seen. And then the last thing I want to talk about HAIMA is that there's one big condition worth mentioning. You cannot stack HAIMA with PANHAIMA that we're just about to speak about in a second here. I desperately wish we could, but that's not where we're at, unfortunately. Imagine 300 barriers that recover themselves on top of the HP bar. That is madness. Of course, you can chain one after the other. Nothing stopping that. They're both on separate cooldowns as we've seen from the live letter, so have fun. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself there, so now we're going to be talking about Pineapple. And so PANHAIMA is going to be an AoE version of HAIMA, same idea, exact same idea. 150 upfront barrier to all allies, and then to all allies, 5 stacks of 150 potency barriers to replace the last barrier that was broken. The exact same effect as HAIMA, but area of effect. Now to say the absolute least, 900 potency of barriers in an area of effect off of the global cooldown will be very, very strong. Think E12S terminal relativity, where there are non-stop volleys of damage coming out in that area of effect, and PANHAIMA is situated in that it will constantly buffer against that damage. That is tremendous. Things like terminal relativity will be a mechanic that the Sage actively laughs at. Also remember that the shield is also above the party's health, so that by itself lowers the spike, and that this doesn't interfere with something like White Mage's Medica 2 ticks in the background or their Healing Dome Asylum. This is totally on top of it. It's going to have some interesting interplay between the White Mage and Sage. I'm definitely looking forward to doing that with my co-healer, name it. The one condition that this will not be impressive is on massive raid-wide AoEs that happen only once, like just one big like 90% party health, just boom. That is still going to be useful though, because it is a basic off GCD weave and can obviously be stacked with Eukrasia Prognosis for that 320 plus 150 from PANHAIMA is going to be 470 potency of barriers up front, which is going to really take that sting off regardless. Unfortunately, since we would not be talking about successive area effect uses, it's very likely that the party is going to have 4 stacks of HAIMA remaining. We're talking about like the full 30 seconds duration of those buffs, so it's not going to be the most common thing in the world where we see heavy hitting AoE effects over and over and over again, like terminal relativity. That was definitely a capstone mechanic that overwhelmed a lot of healers through prog, but this does mean that those 4 stacks of PANHAIMA will be transformed into 150 multiplied by 4 equals 600 potency of healing in an area of effect after, which is really something that you can try to plan around. Like depending on the regen uses or your co-healers healing, this may or may not be useful, but I see it personally right now until we get into the Pandemonium Endwalker raids. For the wide majority of cases, this is just going to end up being overhealing waste or just random chip damage scrap heals down the line, really. I'm going to say something that I know is going to be very obvious to all of you, but this should be noted as a valid use case because it is since this is exactly like HAIMA but in an area of effect, there is no reason why you could not just use this on a single target, like during a dungeon pull. Why not? If HAIMA's already on cooldown, may as well. If the tank's being wailed on, just think about it. But similar to HAIMA, PANHAIMA does not stack with HAIMA. It's kind of like pizza. You want the HAIMA and the pineapple, but you can't get both apparently in 14. God darn it. So now we're going to get into section 2.3, which is on modification abilities. And so modification abilities are all about granting temporary boosts or changes to your playstyle. I'm avoiding using the term augmentation, which is what I would normally use, like in my machinist guide I've used it. Really because as a section header, I don't want people to confuse it with the EUCRASIA system. That would be very bad. This is very different than the EUCRASIA system. The section, however, I'm making following the healing section because I'd largely argue that these are going to be interacting with the healing toolkit. In fact, I think I'd win that argument because that's what they're doing. But there are going to be a total of 3 abilities here. So the first healing modification ability is going to be RIZOMATA, which simply gives you 1 stack of Addersgall immediately on a short 90-second cooldown. There's no denying that this is going to be incredibly powerful. So much so that I will make the argument that you want to keep the cooldown rolling whenever possible. Like if you spent all of your Addersgall and have none left, even if you don't need it immediately, you should instinctually be pressing this button to get that cooldown rolling. What this translates into is more off GCD heals like IXOCHOLE being used, which is gonna later take pressure off of your chest for more healing off of you, so more damaging abilities. Always keep that Sage flow in mind. Or alternatively, think about it like maybe a free KERACHOLE that is going to be a powerful mitigation, or like 500 area of effect potency heal. As I've said before, this is stupidly strong. RIZOMATA is just one ability that lets you push the Sage's off global cooldown even further. Our next healing modification ability is KRASIS, which is absolutely going to be crazy. Okay, that joke might not have landed as well as I had hoped. So KRASIS is going to give a single target 20% more healing power on a decent duration of 10 seconds, but what makes this absolutely stupid is the fact that it is on a accessible 60-second cooldown. This means that KRASIS can be combined to produce massive single target tank buster padding barriers with ease. Anyone who has played Swaller absolutely knows how fantastic a bard using Nature's Manet is, and this is for all intents and purposes the exact same thing as KRASIS. To have a bard use Nature's Manet and then combine it with a Scholar's Adlo Galvanize barrier, or even more maddening if you get like a crit Adlo for Galvanize and Catalyze, That is such a good ability. Big combo. But now the Sage has this KRASIS ability in their own kit, which enables them to have full control over when and where it's used and make sure that it's used, which has been a problem because, I mean, if another bard isn't going to use it and you're depending on it, bad stuff. Y'all know what it is like if you've been playing Scholar for a bit. But where this 20% healing amplification is just used by the Sage themselves, no bard requirement, it's nuts. Like, just for an example, take the standard Eucrasian diagnosis is going to be 300 potency, and that's going to be 300 amplified by 20% is 360 healing potency. Now 180% of that is going to be 648 barrier potency, and that is on a 60-second cooldown of demand. Beefy. Or if you can get a crit, then, as you well can imagine, it becomes absolutely hilarious, like absolutely nutty. Now remember that you can combine this with HAIMA or even PANHAIMA if you want to be saucy for yet another baseline 150 potency barrier. Even in a super cynical world, every 60 seconds, the Sage can produce on a tank like a 900 potency barrier, which is gonna also pad out the successive hits because of HAIMA and its effect. To say the least, this is ridiculous. So now we're down to our last modification ability, which is going to be Zoe, which is going to double the amount cured by your next healing spell, and this is going to be on a fair 90-second cooldown timer. Now the key phrase to notice here on this tooltip is that it is saying healing spell. This means off of the global cooldown abilities like IXOCHOLE are going to be completely skipped by Zoe's double healing effect. Now let's talk about the fact that this is still ridiculous, because on the complete flip side we can see that Zoe is going to make it so that even a spell as simple as Prognosis at 300 potency of healing now heals for 600 potency of healing in an area of effect. That is more than a Cure 3 in Shadowbringers for the White Mage, which is a very well known legendary burst heal that also chugs their MP like no other. But more than that, I want to skip another outburst about barriers because we've done that enough. Like, you can imagine some bonkers stuff. But now imagine this with the healing spell Pneuma. Zoe with Pneuma is going to be crazy. So Pneuma is going to be a healing spell that has a baseline potency of 400 for healing. We're not talking about damage. What this means is that we now have an 800 potency burst area of effect heal that doesn't cost us any damage because Pneuma does the same damage as DOSIS and applies a 10% mitigation to the party. In terms of loopy strong combinations for the Sage, this is extremely high on that list, especially because it doesn't impact Kardia procs or damage output. This is definitely a combo to note. So section 2.4 is on mobility actions, and you know what, I wanted to make it its own independent section just because to me it is hilarious that a healer gets a mobility ability. I don't care if this is stupid to have it on its own. I am so happy about this, guys. So the Sage is going to get the Icarus ability that allows them to zip around the field either to an enemy or to an ally's side. It's that flexible, which is amazing, and this is going to be on a fair 45-second cooldown timer, meaning that this is going to be an option that you can have most of the time. That is a fairly low timer. Not like crazy like the Dancers and Avant, but the Dancers ridiculous, and we all know this by now. But in terms of having this on a healer, this is crazy. This is the only healer mobility ability like it, and it's brilliant. So what this will allow you to do is it will allow you to get into position fast for particular mechanics. Potentially you can combine this with the healer roll action rescue that we're going to be talking about in a second, where basically yards yourself with Icarus and then you can yard that ally. And I'm totally thinking like Thresh Hook in League of Legends, just in case you like hook a like mob in the jungle. Then you have your lantern, you pull your thing, you get the lantern, it drags an ally. No, just me? No one else? Okay, oh no. But the real point here is that it will enable you to do some janky things with positioning and allies positioning. So to say the least about Icarus, I am a huge fan. First time healers are going to be getting a very serious mobility ability, and this is going to be very significant. So now we're at section 2.5, which is going to be a roll action section. And so I'm going to be very honest here. I'm going to be going very quickly over the roll actions for the Sage because there don't seem to be any mind-blowing changes, so this is going to be a pretty breeze through. So first up is going to be Repose, which is going to allow you to cast sleep on a target, and this can be useful to say use on open world maps like Eureka or in solo content like Palace of the Dead, but generally speaking it's not really a raid buff ability that you'd use. I do desperately well, as I'm sure every other healer, wish that this was an interrupt. Next up is going to be Lucid Dreaming, which is one of the most important cross-class skills for healers, and this should be cast as much as possible. And yes guys, I do mean even when you're still high on MP. This is in order to keep your MP levels as high as possible. I cannot emphasize enough just how vital it is to essentially keep this ability on cooldown. Otherwise, if you like use Lucid Dreaming when you're at like no MP, you're still going to be sputtering MP. Make use of this as much as you can. Next up is SURECAST, and SURECAST is another critical ability that allows you to guarantee all your casts go off, which, okay, sure, SURECAST, that is fine and dandy, but what SURECAST is really important for is in Savage raiding, avoiding knockback mechanics allow you to essentially cheese that mechanic. So to say the absolute least, this is a very important skill, very important. ESUNA is going to be a very powerful ability that isn't used as often as one might think, but what it does do is that it cleanses a debuff from an ally, so it's going to be useful things with like E8S Shiva. She's going to have debuffs that you need to cast from allies. Sometimes in certain engagements you're going to have poisons that are cast and need to be cleansed. It's definitely worth a hotbar slot, definitely guaranteed on the stage. Next up is going to be SWIFTCAST, and SWIFTCAST is a very vital skill, especially as a healer. It is going to be allowing you to cast your next spell instantly, which is going to almost always be revive. It is a very notable combination because hard casting revive sucks because it's such a long cast time, but in a pinch it can also prevent deaths by letting you say get off another burst of AoE healing while moving, so definitely worth noting here. Not going to be something that you want to commonly do, but it is something you should consider. And so that brings us to our final role action ability, which is going to be Rescue, and while it might be controversial to say, this is actually excessively important as a skill to acknowledge as a skill to keep on your hotbars, which a lot of healers aren't using it. Use it. And I say that especially because most raiders are technically progression raiders and mistakes are going to happen. Even if you quote-unquote have it on farm or on your 5th clear, you aren't like doing an optimization run at that point. So mistakes happen, and this really allows you to help course correct those mistakes by yanking a team member to your side. Remember that you can combine this with Icarus, which is going to allow a lot of mobility and a lot of range, or alternatively dragging them off of the edge of the platform to their death. Your choice really. So now this brings us to section 3, which is going to be single target and AoE openers and rotations. So we're going to go with single target first, like an extreme trial or a savage raid. Before I actually get into the super nitty-gritty details about it, I want to talk about the raid cooldown windows, and these are going to be very important in Endwalker. And in general, I'm going to be going off of considering it to open up after the dancer's technical step, so that's going to be roughly 5 seconds into the battle, or just after the 3rd global cooldown. So in terms of damaging abilities from highest potency to lowest, our highest potency ability is going to be Eukrasia DOSIS at 700 potency, which is going to be 30 divided by 3 equals 10, and then 10 multiplied by 70 potency is 700 total potency. That is followed up by Phlegma at 510 potency with 2 charges, and then followed by DOSIS at 330 potency per cast, and that is going to be the incredible majority of casts that we do as a sage. I am going to mention Pneuma here just for good measure, which deals 330 potency, but for all intents and purposes you should view this as being a DOSIS cast that you really cast when fudge is about to hit the fan and you want to mitigate things, you want to heal the party. We already talked about that a lot in the Pneuma sections of this guide, but realize that this isn't like a standard raid opener ability. There might be situations you want to do that, but not standard. So whenever anyone talks about a raid encounter, you always need to run a litmus test if it makes sense, and if it has everything to do with raid buff windows. When every party member lines up all their buffs, enemy debuffs, damage amplifications, personal cooldowns, and whatever else that you want to do, everyone in the group should be throwing them all at the same time. It really makes these effects stack together, and it just goes absolutely crazy. Everyone blows their hardest hitting abilities for a tremendous spike of damage. It is just going to go and shoot through the roof. This particular window in general lasts roughly 15 seconds, going off a ninja's trick attack for that value here. So every single global cooldown takes roughly 2.5 seconds to get out there. So you're really looking at 15 divided by 2.5 equals 6. So 6 on GCD of your most powerful 6 spells here in this raid buff window. So this also leads into the idea that the raid buff window opens every 60 seconds after that, since that is Ninja's Trick Attack's cooldown time. Plus, like I did mention earlier in this guide, the developers have emphasized ad nauseum the 60 and 120 second cooldown windows and adjusting core abilities for jobs to line up with those timings. So if you read about an opener or a maintenance phase anywhere for any job in this game on someone else's YouTube channel, any guide that you read anywhere, any Discord server, you should always check that they're respecting the raid buff window. I mean, if you have someone say 700 potency, Eukrasia DOSIS, and Phlegma should be used before the raid buff window opens, like both charges and that, you should have an eyebrow raised being like, is this really the best use of my time? A little bit of a tangent here, but Phlegma has a 45 second cooldown. You really need to ask, is getting another charge realistic for the fight? Is that really going to happen in an enraged timer with the fight? Most cases, 5 seconds is going to be a pretty big no. So kind of getting more to the meat of the argument, when we're talking about raid buff windows, we truly want to get the biggest bang from our buck with the buffs. We really want to get the most high potency amplified to get the biggest bonus that we can. Now, as an extension of that, we put out during that raid window, or we save out our strongest damaging abilities for the next raid buff window. For damage over time effects, they do snapshot to the buffs, and that's why I laid these abilities out onto the table right then and there. 700 potency DOSIS is our heaviest hitting on GCD ability by a large margin. Getting into the opener here, I'm going to be saucy here and pre-pull apply a shield to the tank for an Addersting proc. Usually the barrier is going to be blasted in a few seconds after a pull from the auto attack damage alone, but just to be clear here, remember Addersting is only off of Eukrasian Diagnosis shield breaking, not Eukrasia Prognosis, so definitely don't make that mistake. Remember that this costs you nothing since this is just a pre-pull cast, meaning that's not interfering with your GCDs, it's just something you throw out there before and you forget. Pre-pull, you can also apply that Eukrasian Prognosis shield to, especially because a lot of raids seem to just enjoy volleying out one big burst of damage at the start. Shadowbringer's meta was very interesting with the raids that way. But remember that those AoE shields, the Eukrasian Prognosis, is not going to give you Addersting, just the single target diagnosis, so keep that on your main tank. From here, I'm going to pre-cast DOSIS to align with the initial pull and then immediately follow up with 2 more casts of DOSIS that is going to bring us up to the 5-second mark. It is expected for raid buffs to come along at this point like Ninja's Trick Attack, Dancer's Technical Step, and more. Since Astrologian's buff was completely revamped, I'm not listing that here, so right now I'm looking at Ninja's Trick Attack and then the Dancer's Technical Step being our 2 biggest roadblocks to get this out. I know I said it again, but I can't emphasize it enough. The developers have stressed during every interview so far that they are lining up 60 120-second big cooldown cycles, and so more than ever, aligning your abilities into this window is key. It has always been important, but the developers are really emphasizing this in Endwalker. So now we've reached the point where Eukrasia is going to be what I'm going to be casting after this 3rd DOSIS cast, which is going to add another second for buffs to get out, buying them a little bit more time just in case there's a little bit of delay. From there, I'm going to be tossing out Eukrasian DOSIS, our very powerful damage over time effect. If your GCD is significantly lower than the 2.5 second GCD, I would begin to considering adding a 3rd DOSIS cast just to ensure that you give your team enough time to get their raid buffs out, but that is something that you need to gauge. Like, if your ninjas, like, how to say it? I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus here, but let's say that your ninja just needs a little bit more time to get out their trick attack, or that Dancer's Technical Step is delayed like another GCD. Always be open to adjusting. And I mean, this is a part of the guide, which is kind of a general raid philosophy, but a lot of people like to state things as fact and one size fits all, and group compositions vary from group to group, execution can vary group to group. Remove or add DOSIS casts as necessary to get Eukrasian DOSIS into the start of this window. This is going to be very important because we are going to manage this Eukrasian DOSIS as our little internal timer, because 30 plus 30 is equal to 60. You're always going to know when your second Eukrasian DOSIS is going to be expiring. You know the raid buff window's up. But more on that after we talk about Phlegma. So after this, I'm going to be immediately following this opener up with a cast of Phlegma twice, for both charges to be out just to ensure that we get the most we can out of the raid buffs with this 510 potency monster of an ability. From this point forward, it goes into the maintenance phase. So let's talk about the maintenance phase. Your primary focus is going to be on spamming DOSIS here, no different than you'd probably expect. And then you're going to be refreshing Eukrasian DOSIS whenever the Eukrasian DOSIS that's currently on the target runs out. This is going to indicate the 30-second mark of the rotation, or rather 30-second increments. What adds a small bit of complexity but is a very important test of your patience is Phlegma, and as discussed earlier in the guide, you will regain 1 charge of Phlegma every 45 seconds, so roughly 15 seconds ahead of the 60-second raid buff window opening up again. What you really should be doing is saving Phlegma for when that raid buff window opens again. Use your team's buff. This is why I'm emphasizing this so much. It's going to be important, and this is why the concept of a DPS is so important, not just our DPS. You need to make sure that you're synergizing with your team and utilizing what they offer you. Kind of just going off of the diagram on the chart right now, I mean on the screen right now, is we have the raid buff window open, then we pop both of our Phlegmas, we get Phlegma 3 45 seconds later, Raid buff window 2 is going to open at 60 seconds where we spend that third Phlegma. Phlegma 4 we're going to get 90 seconds after the opener, and then we are going to be spending that fourth Phlegma during the third raid buff window at 120 seconds. We're going to get Phlegma 5 at 135 seconds later, and then we are going to get Phlegma 6 exactly 180 seconds later. So note here that raid buff window 4 is exactly at 180 seconds too, and that means that we are, for the fourth raid window, going to spend 5 and 6. What this really summarizes to is that you can fit in 1 Phlegma each raid buff window and then 2 Phlegma every third raid buff window, and so the timings align almost exactly there, and then this just cycles over and over again on itself. As long as you're tossing out 1 Phlegma every raid buff window, you should be pretty golden, is the general rule of thumb. Or you're going to get the 2 at that one time, and it's going to be such a slight little modification that I'm pretty sure that with a team, you're going to be getting up your raid buffs from that Phlegma, no problem. Now this gets into the discussion of how to track the raid buff windows. So firstly, you need to make sure that your dot is running out, since it is that 30-second timer, and you know from the opener that this is going to mark the start of it. Now the second condition is that you need to have at least 1 charge, or as we just discussed, 2 charges of Phlegma, and that your dot is about to expire. Then you know you're going to be in that raid window next. Otherwise, it's just going to be a 30-second increment. If you don't have a charge of Phlegma, you know, okay, we're halfway there to the next raid buff window. Really, I can't emphasize it enough. The reason why I really like this is because I value my sanity, and I like knowing exactly when a raid buff window is supposed to go up. Just always make sure when you have any kind of job that you try and identify how can you keep track of pivotal key moments like this. Like on the Machinist, we know reassemble is on 55-second cooldown here in Shadowbringers, and then that's gonna mean that the next or the third drill is going to be 60-second interval. Always be thinking about how can I keep track of that raid buff window as a healer. Even that's important now with the Sage. Now this is going to get into Addersting during the maintenance phase, and this is going to be tricky and highly fight dependent to make any wide statements on. Basically, we know Toxicon only really enables us to have more mobility or double weave, and this truly puts us in the unique position where outside of the opener, it is less obvious when you're going to need to apply a shield. Specifically, Eucrasian Diagnosis, not Prognosis. I can't emphasize that enough, guys. I don't want people to leave this guide thinking, oh, Cole said Eucrasian Prognosis works. No, it doesn't. It's Eucrasian Diagnosis. You need that shield to break on that single target, and then you get a charge of Addersting. It's less obvious when you're going to be getting that outside of that opener where you're pre-pull applying it to the tank. But on the flip side, when to use it is also going to be very important to ask. Specifically, you use it, as we said before, more mobility or double weave. It's less obvious, unfortunately, until we get into the actual fights that we're going to see in Pandemonium or the Dragon Song War. Just general rule of thumb, you acquire the Addersting charges when you normally would. You don't go really out of your way to get them. Otherwise, happily sit on the charges until you actually need to use them. They're not giving you more potency than DOSIS, so don't really worry about it, just as long as you have enough that when you do need to use them, you can like chain them. I really wouldn't worry about using them in a raid buff window. It's the same potency as DOSIS right now, unless they buff it right before Endwalker's released. Media Tour though, is exact same potency as DOSIS. I don't know if I see this changing. Now for AoE rotation, it is always funny to say AoE rotation because dungeons are more of a marathon than a sprint, and things can get really ugly at times and they aren't lining up. What if this pack takes 1 minute? What if the same pack takes 1 minute and 30 seconds? It can get really janky, guys. Generally speaking, once the tank has pulled a pack of mobs, I'd rip in with Pneuma for that mitigation, heal, and damage. That's really gonna help take the edge off, and then I'd blow the charges of Phlegma and go to town with Art of War, Discrasia spam. The scholar in me just left out there. Now we just spoke about the rule of thumb for Toxicon usage, and I feel that it applies here in full, 100% full. It's a larger range that can make it convenient to dodge orange markers in large pulls though, so it is a very notable difference. Or if the tank just isn't stopping and you want to get in some damage as soon as they are going like wall to wall, or like, how to say it, before they have reached their final destination, it is a nightmare to try and follow them, especially as a scholar. I have experienced that multiple times where it's like I don't hit like the front pack of mobs, so you can use Toxicon there if you really want to be cheeky. But outside of that, Toxicon, when would you really want to use it? I mean, Discrasia is going to be instant cast, same as Toxicon, so there really isn't a purpose for it in AoE. You can obviously double weave with Discrasia, maybe if you want to like dodge orange markers when the tank's finally pulled, but aside from that, we're talking like fringe benefits here, guys, really fringe at this point. Welcome to section 4, which is going to be the general healing approach section, and this is going to be where I'm really going to describe how the sage should generally approach healing. Since it's extremely similar to the scholar, I am morbidly comfortable that this is going to be all appropriate and exactly the approach that we will see become popular in Endwalker. We're going to be splitting this into its own sections just because this is very bulky to just have its own section. So first up is going to be background healing, specifically Kardia. We're going to follow that with damage mitigation. You don't need to heal off what doesn't hit you. You have off GCD healing, then you have barriers, then you have on GCD healing. And by barriers, I mean specifically on global cooldown barriers, EUCRASIA Diagnosis and EUCRASIA Prognosis, not HAIMA and PANHAIMA. Those are off GCD, so they're packed up there. But I know that when I was going through this list that everyone's mind was probably turning, going, wait, isn't that priority from highest priority to lowest priority? Exactly. So these are going to be set up in this order because this should be your priority list from number 1, most important, and what you should be using the most, to what you should be avoiding as much as you possibly can, since it will interfere with your ability to do damage output. Remember, you are a sage, you are not a white mage, astrologian, you are a bloody sage. You live, you breathe, and you die by your ability to pump out that damage. So always do what you can healing wise to make it sure that you really keep that GCD sacred for DPS. Sacred damage, yes, sage. Just make sure that you need to stop DPSing the absolute least that you possibly can. So first up is going to be background healing, specifically Kardia. And so the first thing is that Kardia, as we described above, is super flexible. In past sections, we really talked about how powerful this can be. This is going to reward every single damage ability with 170 potency of healing, and you could be actively moving it if you were, say, having a tank swap in a party between main or off tank. But you should also consider swapping it to a DPS if the DPS, say, just took chip damage, you just want to get rid of it. This is going to be an ability off the GCD every 5 seconds, so you can change it and it costs nothing. This is where I'm coining the term Kardia weaving, where you're really trying to prevent aimless overheal with it. It is literally like micromanaging Scholar's Fairy, which we have seen in the past, very, very powerful. Even in current day where you don't micromanage it, still very, very powerful. I can't emphasize this enough, especially to newer healers. Always consider the power of your background healing and rotating targets. This is something that white mage and astrologian players know all too well. They can't do this kind of effect. They need to be casting something on the GCD or blowing an off GCD cooldown. This background healing that we can do very easily is something that they definitely want. Really one of the reasons why you're such a powerful co-healer with these healers. You can make up that. The second topic is going to be mitigation, and this is always going to be something that you should be thinking about as a sage or a scholar. Is actually any healer, white mage has temperance too, but it's to proactively really think about your current engagement and your toolbox. What can you do to make it so that you don't need to heal later? And as the sage, we have 3 abilities to provide 10% mitigation. We have KERACHOLE, that is going to be a barrier plus that regen heal tick. Very powerful. We have TAUROCHOLE, that is going to be a 10% damage reduction and a burst heal at once. And then lastly, we have PNHAIMA, which is a massive 10% party-wide mitigation with a heal and with a spike of damage equal to DOSIS. It's going to be really good. Really, really good. I'm actually looking forward to that ability more than I probably should. It is exciting. If you're doing something like approaching a huge raid-wide damage spike, consider dropping down KERACHOLE ahead of it to mitigate that incoming damage and then heal it off after with a trickle. Never forget that KERACHOLE is also going to be a powerful 500 AoE potency health regen. Even in the current content that we have right now before Endwalker's release, the exact same ability exists called Sacred Soil for the Scholar, which is a very well-known healing powerhouse on top of that mitigation. Or if we're in the situation where we have a tank buster or a tank doing wall-to-wall pull, we're looking at TAUROCHOLE. Can't emphasize, don't be shy about mixing and matching these effects. Outside of wasting Addersgall charges, which you can always get one back with RIZOMATA, you can use one effect after another without any issue to prolong a mitigation effect. This is truly going to be an incredibly powerful effect. While 10% might not seem like much, the accessibility through a fight will add up very significantly. Remember, 15-second duration, 15-second cooldown, 50% uptime. That will add up, guarantee you. Another nice aspect of these abilities is that you take no damage loss for using them. PNHAIMA on the GCD, which is the only one on the GCD, the others are off GCDs, does the exact same damage as DOSIS and even triggers Kardia, so you don't need to worry about that. Always remember, you don't need to heal off the damage that you just simply don't have. Now this is the biggest part of the kit, the biggest part of this section, and it's going to be the most important thing to really get a good mastery on, which is off global cooldown abilities. When there is incoming damage that I am either choosing to or to not mitigate, or have mitigated but know is too much to resolve passively through Kardia, my brain is going to instantly go to off GCD abilities. Absolutely no different than the Scholar to today, where I'm asking myself, can the fairy heal the damage? If it can, I literally ignore it. It doesn't exist to me. If not, then I will intervene, usually with an off GCD ability, which is what we're talking about here. Exact same philosophy here. Never let Eos or Selene live rent-free. For the Sage, don't let Kardia live rent-free. Be Kardia weaving. This is actually going to be a very important concept for all healers, which is going to be, I think, really weird for white mage to think about using their off GCDs just with their change too. But all healers are going to be getting a 1.5 second cast time DPS spammable ability, as we discussed at length in the DOSIS section. And some of the biggest strengths of Scholar or Astro in current content was the fact that they could offload so much responsibility off of their global cooldowns. So after your party takes damage, you should really be thinking the following in your mind. At risk of repeating myself, can the Kardia effect alone resolve it? If so, ignore. If not, continue down this list. Remember that you can always modify the effect of Kardia using an off-global cooldown weave of SOTERIA. Remember, you can Kardia weave with SOTERIA and split that up. It's going to be a very effective combo. SOTERIA weave off the GCD makes your next 4 damaging spells heal the Kardia target for roughly the same as spamming Diagnosis on them. Going to amount to 1,360 potency of healing from yet another OGCD weave. Very effective. Maybe instead you're going to be thinking about like applying HAIMA to the tank to shave off the incoming damage with that persistent 150 barrier spam that is replenishing itself over and over again. PANHAIMA is another valid option for that, but remember, PANHAIMA and HAIMA do not stack, they overwrite one another. Or maybe it's area of effect damage. Again, consider PANHAIMA here to take off the edge, especially in Endwalker, a successive, successive weaker area of effect or even stronger area of effect spam like Terminal Relativity that we see today in E12S. PANHAIMA is going to be an absolutely bizarrely powerful effect to offset it, to say the absolute least. That endless deep barrier is going to be wild. Now this kind of gets to the second part of the flowchart, and I know that we put HAIMA and PANHAIMA in there, but like kind of think about it like maybe its own section, because I don't want to say those are regens really, is what I'm kind of trying to say here. They're their own weird thing. The next one is like asking the question, will there be a window of time to let regens tick? If so, consider using PHYSIS 1 or PHYSIS 2 for 700 or 1000 potency over time, which is going to be stupidly huge. Alternatively, consider using KERACHOLE, which is going to have that regen ticking up people beneath that dome with that 500 potency alongside Kardia. That is going to be a lot of healing, do not underestimate it. Now, the next thing on this list is maybe you need a bit more burst. Consider HOLISM for 300 potency burst in an AoE. Maybe HOLISM is down, so go to IXOCHOLE for that AoE burst. But also the Sage has some wild area of effect combos for burst healing, like take Pneuma with that Zoe ability that will double the healing of the next healing spell. Now Pneuma becomes an absolutely bizarre 800 potency of healing explosion across the party. I'm only putting Pneuma here because it still has that 330 DOSIS potency, and Zoe is going to be a very powerful off-GCD modification ability. I have fangirled about this combo like 3 times already in this video. Guys, this is going to definitely be a Sage go-to. But another combination of Zoe as an off-global cooldown weave is that it turns Prognosis, that I'm going to be talking about, that you should avoid in a bit. But Prognosis has a baseline 300 potency heal on the GCD, but I am going to be saying that Zoe with Prognosis turns it into a 600 potency burst, which is very significant. Just to be clear, note that Prognosis is on its own just a flat 300 potency heal on the GCD. That means you get no DOSIS, means you don't proc Kardia. Generally speaking, HOLISM or IXOCHOLE are going to almost always be preferred. Alternatively, maybe it's just single target burst. Consider DRUOCHOLE, which is going to be maybe a single target damage attack, and then the tank is going to take successive damage after, like a dungeon pull. TAUROCHOLE. Also remember that you can always off the global cooldown weave in a cast of KRASIS, which will amplify the healing a single target takes by a huge amount. I want to take a note on cooldowns actually for a moment here. PHYSIS 1 and HOLISM are extremely accessible 60-second cooldown timers, and you should be very eagerly using them. Or maybe your tank has just taken a whacking, or is about to take a whacking. PHYSIS 1 actually can be a huge help here. That heal over time that I have used ad nauseum, as Whispering Dawn, the equivalent ability for it, it is a big help on Scholar. Already, today, I've used it way too much. Holism, not so much, because I have used Fade Blessing. It helps a little, but it's not something that I'm going to be going crazy over like I will for the 700 potency of PHYSIS 1. Let alone Sacred Soil, which is another off-global cooldown where you're getting that mitigation plus that 500 tick. Recently on my channel, I was talking a lot about regen effects and how they can offset a lot of damage for you, and how it was actually more significant than a lot of people think, and I can't emphasize enough. I'm giving you like the diet version here from playing too much Scholar for mortal hands, is that Whispering Dawn is busted. Sacred Soil with Whispering Dawn, busted. Interweaving them, very strong. Don't discount your heal over time effects unless you really need to use a burst. How to say it? The big thing on the Sage is that you're going to really need to learn to let heal over time effects tick. Let them do their work, and that is going to include Kardia and background healing. Many healers often see the party spike to 50% health, cast Whispering Dawn or Medica 2, which is appropriate, and then they spam Plenary Indulgence, Afflatus Rapture on top of it, all these different things. You have the Scholar using In Dawn with Recitation, and then it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Not only are you losing cooldowns, but that is a disgusting amount of overhealing. Like, you need to get used to letting these cooldowns really work. This is actually something that causes the Scholar, which is going to be a problem that the Sage is still going to have, definitely, because the Sage is so similar to the Scholar, is the concept of running out of gas. If you're wasting your abilities like that, that's going to be horrible. Like, you shouldn't be thinking, oh, I need to spam all my Serpent Skull right now because the party got lowered to 60% health. Oh my god. That is exactly how you are going to end up hating the Sage and complaining on the forum saying it needs a buff. You're going to run out of gas so quick on the Sage like that. Don't do it. Don't do it. Let those beautiful, gorgeous, hot AF regens tick and do some work. Was I doing it right there? I don't know. The fact is, the heal over time effects are very, very hot. Very, very hot. So I know that EOS doesn't live rent-free for me on Scholar. Don't let PHYSIS, don't let Kardia, or any other heal over time effect do so either. Make them work. Outside of a few intentional mechanics that you need to hit 100% HP, you don't need to hit 100 HP. Usually 85 to 90 will be fine. Now we're talking about barriers, and I'm talking about on the GCD barriers here, Eucrasian Diagnosis and Eucrasian Prognosis. Remember, always use protection. Oh my god, guys, I can't even say that correctly without laughing at myself. But remember, protection is hot. As Paris Hilton would say, that's hot. So note for this section that I'm not talking about off-global cooldown barriers like HAIMA or Pineapple, which, yeah, we are going to be stacking with these other barriers most likely. If we need to pull them out, we may as well totally pull them out. We're just talking about Eukrasian Diagnosis and Eukrasian Prognosis here. The other two, use eagerly. They're off-global cooldowns. They're great. So these on GCD barriers are like the second last thing that you want to do, and this is something to really consider when your party's HP is at risk of going below 0, or if you really need to pad incoming AoE damage beyond HAIMA or PANHAIMA's capabilities. I swear if I say ham and pineapple once more. So I'm going to be real with you. I am one to agree that during progression rating, which is what 99.9% of us are actually doing, that it can be a huge relief to my heart rate and levels of panic to keep a shield out for AoE that might only, and I say, kind of laughing to myself at only lower your party's health to 10%. Then this is fine and good for progression. But in an ideal scenario, you just let the damage slam into your party like that and make your group all weep and cry out in horror, flailing about, and then let Kardia, Mitigation, and your off GCD Heals resolve it. So generally speaking, is it optimal to use barriers unless you absolutely need to use them? No, it is not. But here is where my experience with doing progression rating really needs to step into play, as well as I have talked to many Ultimate Raiders that completely agree. It is honestly like, how to say it? Protection. You should always be using protection. That is actually what I have heard from many people who have cleared all 3 ultimate raids and farmed them and literally have unlocked every single weapon. I have gotten that advice directly from them, and so I am quite confident that my feelings on this are confirmed. Optimization rating? Avoid. But when you're doing progression rating, which is honestly, as I said, 99.9% of what the rating player base is doing, wearing protection is very much a confidence boost. Now, if you are in the super awkward position where all of the cooldowns are down, where there's big bursty damage incoming, like you don't have mitigation out, you don't have any Serpent Skull, I would consider Eukrasian Diagnosis to shield the tank from a tank buster. This is in conjunction with TAUROCHOLE, which could be like more than enough mitigation for the tank buster. Actually, screw that. I was just saying like we have nothing, so you wouldn't even have TAUROCHOLE. So like you're taking it pretty raw. That tank buster you're taking raw, and trust me, you don't want to take it raw. But like let's say that you do have like a few cooldowns available. So you do have TAUROCHOLE, 10% mitigation on that tank buster. Let's say that you also have HAIMA up, which you can combine HAIMA and then Eukrasia Diagnosis Barrier, which is going to be that Eukrasia Diagnosis Barrier plus 150 potency of upfront barriers, and then it's going to soften the successive incoming auto attack blows to that tank. This is going to be, to say the least, an extremely powerful, very, very, very powerful effect in both raid and dungeon scenarios, ironically enough, since PANHAIMA is the exact same effect, but in an area of effect. You could even be cheeky and use that if you have accessibility to that to pad the tank further too. You're gonna have so much fun in Endwalker with me wiping the party. Or if there's large raid wide that risks wiping the entire party from burst damage, you could use Eukrasia Prognosis for shields, put that under KERACHOLE for that 10% mitigation regen, or truly push it and throw an even Numa into the mix so you get that very powerful upfront mitigation. And then let's not forget, apply PANHAIMA happily. Apply the pineapples very liberally to the pizza. Get the pineapples everywhere. How many people unsubscribed for me saying a pineapple on pizza joke? Can't help that I love Hawaiian pizza. Alternatively, if you want a ton of value, you could use Eukrasia Diagnosis for a single target shield, or Eukrasia Prognosis for an AoE shield. Let those shields just take a little bit of damage and then double dip on the shield value and use PEPSI right before the shields completely break. Eukrasia Prognosis, even on its own, not doing that though, is pretty strong because you get that heal from Eukrasia Prognosis. 100 potency. Okay, it's not that great, guys. But the fact is that you then get the PEPSIS 350 AoE heal potency, which is going to add up to 450 AoE heal potency. So no doubt, Eukrasia Prognosis as an AoE heal, meh. When you get to double dip, okay, now we're talking real money. Well, especially as a Sage, always have that recovery plan in mind, especially for AoE. Note that PEPSI doesn't work on HAIMA or Pineapple, so exclusively Eukrasia Diagnosis or Eukrasia Prognosis. Now this is bringing us to our last case, which is going to be casting on global cooldown heals. Barriers, I did make an exception before in its own section just now, but sometimes you really do need a barrier, but on GCD Heals, oh boy, how to say it. This is what we refer to in the Deep Scholar lore as running out of gas. And that is when all of your cooldowns are used, nothing is up, and you are completely out of Addersgall charges, which thankfully you gain one every 20 seconds rather than waiting a full bloody 60 seconds for 3 stacks with Flow, which will help immensely for the Sage, not to mention RIZOMATA will give you 1 charge of the Serpent's Gall. But the trick is, regardless of me saying all that, that's not going to help you when you're 15 seconds off of your next charge. You need your next charge of Addersgall right now. This is the state, the crappy, horrible state that you never want to be in, where you might need to consider casting Diagnosis or Prognosis. Not for the memes. Especially with the Kardia system, this is going to be very punishing. Kardia is a 170 potency heal every damage spell. Diagnosis is at 450 potency, and you are really only healing for 280 more potency at the cost of no damage going out. Like, just cast DOSIS 2 more times for 340 potency of healing. Like, that is going to make up for that. But this fact is just, how to say it? This is a bad state to be on the Scholar. It sucks, but I can say that this is a million times worse for the Sage because the Scholar's Fairy is keeping on farting out Embrace on allies, so they're taking less of a hit. For Sage, it's like, good game, pack up your bags, this sucks. Prognosis, I will say as a Scholar main for far too long, is that Prognosis being a raw heal is really, 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 really nice. The flip side is, geez, flying corn dog on a stick, you do not want to cast Prognosis unless you really need to. If you need to cast Prognosis more than a few times in a fight, really look at your co-healer and ask them, why are they the way that they are? The Astro and the White Mage can fart out Medica 2 or Aspected Helios for astoundingly more pure healing potency. Whack them with a Nulis a few times for putting you in this position. Now where is my co-healer boyfriend who is undeniably going to force me to do this a few times? I've got a Nulis for him. I joke. Of course, sort of. Where the f— now it's wrap up time for the healing approach section. And so generally speaking, the healing methodology that every Sage needs to keep having to train themselves to have like screaming in the back of their mind is keep DPS and keep pumping out Kardia procs, because Kardia will be very significant if you allow it to be so. Leverage your toolkit to facilitate this. Enable yourself. The Sage's kit that we already have seen and explored through this video is exceedingly powerful. It has a ton of tools to whip out to boost Kardia's effects spread out the effects of barriers with HAIMA, PANHAIMA, powerful regens in the party. The weird regenerating shields like HAIMA and Pineapple are going to be bizarre. Burst heals like IXOCHOLE, the mitigation, there is just a whole lot that you can do to make sure that you keep your GCD sacred. Healing on the Sage is really at its peak, using these powerful abilities to keep your on-global cooldown sacred and filled with DPS skills to continue to leverage Kardia and push in rage times to get the group to clear through your damage. Anyone who has progged a savage fight knows all too well, like this recent tier was E11S was a big wall for groups. That enrage timer was very much too steep for some groups. Everyone knows getting that enrage timer, healer DPS makes all the difference. Meow. We get into the section of key takeaways about the Sage, and it's a little bit more flavorful here with some of my opinions mixed into it. But remember, this is just one dude's opinion, like, it's an opinion, and honestly, like, I welcome, like, other people, like, talking and, like, debating about it in the comments. Like, it's just, like, if you disagree, like, I'm totally open to hearing it. Maybe I just have the wrong perspective, looking at it from the wrong angle, totally open to it. But this is, like, the key takeaways, but very flavorful. So really, my first talking point is that I am left concerned about the Sage, because ultimately, the Sage's healing paradigm is about literally blasting non-stop and doing whatever it takes to keep blasting. I'm gonna start blasting and I'm gonna keep blasting. But looking at the kit and knowing how Scholar plays, the Sage really does have the kit to do some disgusting, degenerate things, and I love it for that. But I think many people that hate, and there are a lot, that hate the Scholar's style of healing, that look at the Sage as some kind of like new different thing, are going to be largely disappointed. Obviously not all. Like, unless your specific issues with the Scholar are things like the fairy can have a delay, which mind you is largely mitigated by manually placing it in the middle of the arena pre-pull, which for some reason people just don't do or choose not to do or just don't know that that helps that, or fairly flat and outright boring broil spam, or having the ability to micromanage and aim your fairy, or the ability to run out of gas. Actually, never mind, that's still something Sage has for sure. Still gonna look at our co-healer like they're from outer space sometimes. The main thing is, like, if those aren't really your specific issues with the Scholar, Sage is probably not what you're looking for if you already hate the Scholar's healing kit. It kind of does break my heart to say that. Like, also, it also breaks my heart to read the comments. It's the Scholar main for so many years that it's just like there have been comments from people just lambasting on Scholar on things that aren't those topics. Like the Scholar memes, yeah, a lot of them were funny. Like, I mean, like, haha, they get like the Scholar waddle. But like, I've seen some of the most horrible comments towards the Scholar saying the entire healing toolkit's scrapped, they should do away with all this and that and this and that. And I look at the Sage and I'm like, a lot of the things you're raising as concerns aren't things that the Sage alleviates in any capacity. Like, I cannot emphasize, the kits are like 85% the same, and thus the way they approach healing is largely the same. The Sage also comes with the added caveat complexity on top of it that while the Scholar's Fairy will auto-aim itself and cast Embrace on targets without your instruction, this is gonna unfortunately not be a thing the Sage has. The Sage needs to manually be Kardia weaving to targets non-stop through casting damage spells. While you as a Sage will be penalized for casting Diagnosis or Prognosis, a Scholar with the Fairy also doesn't care. Or if the Scholar runs around the arena like a chicken or something, the Fairy is just going to keep casting. It doesn't give a crap. Where the Sage with poor mobility planning will really suffer. So in the most odd way I can imagine, I feel like for all of the hype that the Sage is getting, it's going to brutally, bitterly, and agonizingly disappoint some people. It might be a meme to say, though I doubt it's caught on yet, but I've been saying it. It's like white mages never stop casting Glare to heal, and an Endwalker, with how I already know a lot of people play, as well as like people's mentalities towards healing, I'm a healer and I play a healer to heal. Don't ask me to DPS. I hear this all the time. I am on YouTube and it's just like I am hearing this non-stop. This is definitely one of the most, prevalent mentalities out there. So like a white mage never stops casting Glare to heal, and Endwalker Sages are gonna be never DPSing, never stopping spamming diagnosis to DPS, and that's going to lead them to ultimately fall flat on their faces going, Sage is really gimped, Sage is really weak, Sage is terrible, Sage is the worst class I've ever played, because factually, you will fall behind a Scholar by a lot, and likewise from a white major ass by a huge margin if you aren't doing that. And to be blunt, at that point you're playing a severely gimped Scholar. Now my second talking point is the exact opposite, where I am genuinely excited for the Sage. So for me, I have loved the Scholar inside out and backwards for almost a decade now. Aurora Reborn was in 2013 and we're in 2021 now, and it's beyond trippy and messed up to think about that, but that's the actual reality. Scholar, however, has had problems that I have talked about at large on my channel. First off is that pet potency scaling is not clear to newer players. Veterans like me know to multiply the value I see by like 0.82 to get the real value. It's just a little bit less than you'd expect. Not too much, but definitely less. Next thing is there is factually some level of delay with the fairy. This is true. It is far from major though, and many people I think overblow it, but the trick is that newer players to Scholar don't know that they need to manually place the fairy. Because like the fairy will prioritize movement over your spell casts. Like try macroing and moving the fairy around with your mouse and see how long you can move it until it finally casts Whispering Dawn. There does seem to be an inherent delay on getting the spells out in quick succession, though it's far different and far less than what a lot of people say. It's just slightly less snappy than double weaving on a job, like say Machinist with Gauss Round and Ricochet. That's boom boom instant. You don't get that with the fairy. Another problem that I personally had a little bit of a problem with was the ghosting of fairy actions, though largely with practice this is something that you could learn to avoid, but the fact that I had to worry about that was initially pretty disturbing. I didn't really like that. Like try casting Fey Illumination then immediately summon Seraph. Where's the Fey Illumination? The Sage doesn't need to worry about that at all. Another thing was that the DPS rotation was not engaging enough for me on Scholar. I love the Scholar of old, but the Broil spamming current version isn't doing that for me. The Sage builds up on like this basic Broil spam, although it's called DOSIS for the Sage, and it is definitely still there. You are spamming DOSIS, which is definitely a Broil equivalent, but with a host of new tools on top of it, Flagrant with the charges, the Serpent Sting, and the rest, it makes me genuinely excited, and it's just like, it builds up enough that I'm like, this will keep me engaged, or likely will. I guess we'll find out in like 4 months. Another thing was fairy control over healing. Many times I just want the fairy to just focus heal on the tank, for instance, rather than heal random chip damage on DPS, which sometimes you really do want it to randomly heal chip damage on DPS. But the loss of control sucked. I used to macro it, many Scholars used to macro it, but can't anymore. The auto-targeting is powerful and I don't want to lose that. It's such a huge perk of the Scholar. This is definitely something that is going to make the Scholar preferable to the Sage for so many players, but losing that level of control did suck. Or take Aetherflow, where you can completely go out of gas for theoretically 60 seconds, but you don't really get, how to say it, Scholar, you use Aetherflow, you get 3 stacks off the bat, bam. You don't get gradual stacks of Aetherflow every 20 seconds, which is what the Sage is really essentially getting with their stacks of Serpent Skull. I mean, I get it, just manage it properly, just another thing to learn, but this is one of those quality of life things where it's like, oh, just learn to get over it, you big baby. But it's just like, honestly, I would rather to just get them gradually over time like the Sage does. But like, I keep going on and on. The point is, and I could actually keep going on and on maybe more, but the point is that I have my grievances with the Scholar, and it is not how it approaches healing in any capacity. I've in fact said on this channel, I love the healing kit of the Scholar. It's intuitive to me, it keeps you on my toes and engaged. I'm thinking proactively about mitigation, about barriers, I love it. And it's really all of those other factors combined, these little quality of life things that make me agonizingly confident that I'm not only going to love the Sage, but also be successful with it. It's in my mind Scholar with tremendous quality of life improvements and a cooler DPS rotation. Bam! This is what I've been asking for on my channel over and over again. This is everything I wanted. So I know I'm happy. It's like the Sage was for all intents and purposes crafted for me. Trust me, I'm not delusional. No crap, it obviously was not actually made for me. But I've never really resonated with a class in any video game so strongly before. I'm just immensely, genuinely happy, and in case my obsession with the Sage hasn't clearly told you that story on this channel, it's gonna be stunningly effective as a healer, and it's always gonna have a place in groups, and it's gonna be very, very fun for players like me. Maybe Scholar becomes like the predominant meta healer. I think that honestly both are like on enough of an even playing field. I don't see that happening, but maybe that happens. I'm still probably gonna be playing Sage no matter what, because like this feels right.